Good evening. I'm Christina Broderick, Program Committee Co-Chair for the League of Women Voters of Greenwich. I want to thank everyone for joining us. The League of Women Voters is a membership organization which works to empower voters. We believe that the freedom to vote is a nonpartisan issue, and we envision a democracy where every person has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the ability to participate. On behalf of the League of Women Voters, I'd like to welcome you to a webinar discussion with Connecticut Mirror reporter Keith Phaneuf. Over the course of the next hour, Keith will share some of what he sees as what's at stake in the November election. Keith will speak specifically on the significance of off-year elections and forward-looking issues which may be of particular importance to Connecticut voters. Keith has spent most of his 34 years as a reporter specializing in state government, finances, analyzing such topics as income tax equity, waste in government, and the complex funding systems behind Connecticut's transportation and social services networks. He has been the state finances reporter at the Connecticut Mirror since it launched in 2010. Prior to joining the Connecticut Mirror, Keith was State Capitol Bureau Chief for the Journal-Enquirer of Manchester, a reporter for the Day of New London, and a former contributing writer to the New York Times. Keith is a graduate of and a former journalism instructor at the University of Connecticut. Today's session will consist of a 35-minute presentation by Keith, followed by a 20-minute question and answer session. Audience questions can be submitted via the Q&A link throughout the presentation. The League of Women Voters would like to remind you that all election-related information can be found on the website vote411.org. And we encourage you to mark your calendar to vote on November 8th. Before I hand over the presentation to Keith, I would like to welcome Bruce Putterman to say a few words. Mr. Putterman is the CEO and publisher of the Connecticut Mirror, and we're happy that he can join us this evening.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you everybody for welcoming Keith and me tonight. As you may know, the Connecticut Mirror is a nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization, and we were founded in 2009, first published in 2010 in response to a kind of cascading of contractions of newsrooms all around the country, including here in Connecticut, and kind of the immediate impetus was a mass firing of the press corps up in Hartford. And so some concerned residents of the New Haven area formed the Connecticut Mirror and found the funding for 3 years to fund an organization that would fill the void left by contracting newsrooms. And the reason I think that is important is for really the same reason that Christina said that you all do your work, which is to work to empower voters. Journalism in all of its forms is critical to a thriving democracy, both in terms of helping people identify whom to vote for, but also how to engage and whom to advocate for and what campaigns to contribute to or volunteer on, or what causes to support financially, and how to engage with your elected officials. You know, Connecticut is not a news desert. That's a term that refers to geographies that don't have any newspaper for miles and miles around. There are, in fact, 18 daily newspapers in the state of Connecticut, but Connecticut is what is sometimes referred to as news poverty, which means there are still daily papers, but those papers are all shrinking considerably. The Hartford Courant, in fact, long-time dominant newspaper in the state, used to have 400 reporters in their newsroom as recently as 15 or 20 years ago. Today, they have 30. And the same is true in many other news organizations around the state. So our role is to fill that void, particularly in terms of covering news related to public policy and government in Connecticut. One quick thing about our structure. So we are a nonprofit, and that means that roughly 90% of our revenue is contributed, either foundations or from individuals. Only about 10% of it is from advertising or from selling or licensing our content to other news organizations in the state. You may have seen a Connecticut Mirror byline. You may have seen Keith's byline, in fact, in the Greenwich Time or the Stamford Advocate. That's because the Hearst newspapers that own the Time and the Advocate and others, they pay us a small licensing fee to republish our content. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Keith Phaneuf to you. I have heard Keith talk about the state budget and state politics in general, probably 20 times since I started at the Mirror 5 years ago. And I always learn something new every time and always entertained. So enjoy Keith's presentation. And I look forward to potentially meeting some of you soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Bruce. Thank you, excuse me, to the league. It's an honor and a pleasure to give the presentation. I want to apologize up front. I'm struggling with a little bit of allergies today, so there may be the occasional cough. Also, if you see me look down, I'm not too distracted. I've actually tried to keep a stopwatch function on my phone going just so I can really stay with this time limit. I was telling the organizers before we started that the first time I timed out this talk, it was over 2 hours, which of course was way too long. I just threw everything down at first, and then I've done a lot of editing. But if at times this seems like the lightning round, I apologize. I want to try to get to as many issues as possible. I've left with Christina Broderick my email address and my Twitter address. If for any reason we just run out of time, please feel free to reach out to me if you had a question that didn't get answered, and I'll do my best. So we've got until about 7:40 for me to go through things, and then we will open it up to questions. As I looked at this, what are the issues that are at stake? It's easy to begin by saying, well, what are the candidates talking about? And certainly that's important. Certainly that's something that I want to focus on, but I want to make sure that we broaden it a bit. Most of the topics that we're going to talk about tonight, you will have heard discussed by Governor Lamont or by Bob Stefanowski or some of the other candidates for the General Assembly or constitutional officers or for Congress. But there are other issues that the candidates may not take an interest in. There are some issues candidates in a particular race may agree that neither of them wants to discuss, but they're still important to you, and I think we should try to go over those as well. There'll also be an issue that, say, for example, the gubernatorial candidates either don't see coming or are not in a hurry to tackle, but perhaps the General Assembly is really serious about. So I've tried to take as broad an approach to that as I could. As Bruce mentioned, I do spend a lot of time writing about state finances. So I sort of use the moderator's privilege, and I opened with that. And this has been sort of a very interesting topic in the last few years, because the question that I get asked all the time is, so are we rich or are we poor? Or is Connecticut in good shape or bad shape? Are we taxing too much? Are we taxing too little? Because this really has been in the last few years sort of a tale of two cities thing, a best of times, worst of times. And it really does depend on your perspective, but I will try to help you sort it through. One of the things that we're hearing a lot in this campaign, and that's going to absolutely be at stake when the state legislature reconvenes in January, is what some are calling the largest tax cut in state history. And I don't mean that as a cynical term. It absolutely is one of the largest tax cuts in state history. However, you can't just stop the conversation there. Generally, the state of Connecticut, and for that matter, most states don't cut taxes that often. So that's some perspective right there. Secondly, even though this tax relief has gotten a lot of press, we're talking about a gasoline tax holiday. We're talking about a one-time income tax rebate for families with children. We're talking about an ongoing increase in another income tax credit that helps to offset your local property tax bills. There's a one-time payment to the working poor. There's a common theme there, and that is a little more than half of this aid is one time. And it's going to be very difficult, very challenging, even with the surplus dollars we're going to talk about, for the legislature to maintain what they have and to make some of the one-time stuff ongoing next year. But let's talk about that. Are we in good shape or are we in bad shape? Here are some of the numbers that I just want to quickly throw at you, and don't get lost in the digits. We'll break them down. We had a $4.3 billion surplus last fiscal year. Just to give you some idea, that $4.3 billion surplus was 20% of the entire general fund. We had a $2.3 billion surplus projection only a few days ago for the fiscal year we're in now, which granted, we're only 3 months in, and we've got $3.3 billion in the rainy day fund. So that's, I just threw out at you about $9.9 billion in black ink. Set that against $95 billion in long-term debt. Basically, all the good news you've read about over the last couple of years, we owe 10 times that amount over the long haul in pension debt, retiree healthcare program debt, and bonded debt. But those numbers can still be very daunting. So I'd like to try to break them down in another way. That rainy day fund I mentioned, $3.3 billion. That's about 15% of the state's annual operating budget. And the surplus projection for this year that I mentioned, that's another $2.3 billion. That's about 10%. So that's what we have in place to deal with faltering stock markets, a housing market that's arguably already in correction, and a job market that, quite frankly, gets too little attention. And what I mean by that is, keep in mind, we still, despite all the stuff you're hearing about employers want to hire, we still have not recovered 36,000 of the jobs that were lost at the worst point of the pandemic in June of 2020. And please take into account that when the pandemic hit, we still, after a decade, had not recovered 30,000 of the jobs lost in the Great Recession of 2007 through 2009. So we're about 66,000 jobs below where employment level was before things went south in 2007. So that, going back to that cushion I talked about, $3.3 billion in the rainy day fund, $2.3 billion surplus projection for this year. That's equal to 25–30% of the general fund. Is it enough? Honestly, the best answer I can give you is it might be, but I can tell you for sure it is not a sure thing. And I don't know how much that's going to help you breaking down what the candidates are saying, because of course, depending on where they're coming from, the incumbents are saying we're in great shape, and the challengers are trying to say, no, we're in deep trouble. But I'd like you to keep this in mind. In the last recession, we had a $1.4 billion rainy day fund, and we borrowed another $1 billion. Those two stopgap measures were equal to about 14%, almost equal percentage-wise to the current rainy day fund. We tore through that in a year. And the next year, we had another 20% hole. It really depends on if this downturn is as bad or close to as bad as the last recession. Believe it or not, we could still exhaust everything. On top of all that, the state's unemployment trust is nearly empty. We are borrowing money frequently to cover unemployment benefits to get us through the pandemic. If we go into a deep recession, we're going to be looking at more borrowing. The problem with that is until we get the unemployment trust, what's deemed solvent, which is to actually have enough money to cover a year's worth of benefits, we will be raising the unemployment, the federal unemployment tax will be increasing on businesses every January. That's going to begin this coming January. That's going to be a problem for a while, because right now that trust has about nothing in it, and it needs to have about $1.4 billion in it to be solvent. How will either Governor Lamont or Bob Stefanowski, a Democrat-controlled legislature or a Republican legislature, seek to deal with this potential hole in state finances going forward if the recession arrives and if it turns really, really deep? Believe it or not, I'm not expecting either party ultimately to be that far apart. Right now, what they're saying, and certainly what's at stake, is nobody wants to increase the top marginal rate on the income tax except the far left on the Democratic Party. And right now, within the Democratic Party, you have a moderate governor and you have enough moderates in the legislature that they can block anything. So while I expect some pushback from the left, and I don't mean this to criticize one side or the other, I see a majority of the legislature and whoever the next governor is wanting to try to deal with the next downturn without touching the top income tax rate. That really wasn't tested during the pandemic because we got so much federal aid. But what we're hearing from the congressional delegation, what we're hearing from a lot of people is that Washington probably doesn't have many more arrows left in its quiver, and it's questionable if we go into a deep recession whether there'll be that kind of aid. One last thing on the finances that I just wanted to mention, because some people had asked me about property taxes. That is and will remain for a long time probably one of the biggest sticking points for the legislature, just because it's such a huge challenge. If you think the state relies too much on property taxes, you're not alone. I think most people feel that way. Just to give you some perspective, we raise about $12 billion a year from the state income tax. That funds about half of the entire budget. Connecticut roughly collects double that in property taxes across 169 cities and towns. We've done 2 tax fairness studies in our history, 2014 and 2022. Generally, legislatures and governors don't like to do them because people don't want to look at the problem. But because it's very easy to shift property tax burdens, landlord can pass them on to renters. We find that the poorest 10% of the people in Connecticut are generally losing about 26% of all their income just to state and local taxes. The wealthiest 10% are only paying about 6 to 7%. This is going to remain an issue for a long time. You will see, if you're not looking to touch the income tax's top rate, you're not going to be able to do much when it comes to property taxes. So let me move on for a minute to affordable housing. I'm sure you probably heard, if you caught this afternoon's debate between Governor Lamont and Bob Stefanowski, there was talk about that. And despite some of the rhetoric in the debate, I would argue this is another area where at least the gubernatorial candidates aren't as far apart as you might think. Bob Stefanowski wants to repeal the statute that's known as 830G. Governor Lamont does not. This statute offers remedies to developers in court if they're denied permission by a local zoning board to build an affordable housing complex. Towns are exempt from this if at least 10% of the housing stock is affordable. And again, Bob Stefanowski wants to repeal this. Governor Lamont does not. But here's why I say they're still both very similar. Both of them support local control. Both of them basically say they would like to see more affordable housing, but they want to use the carrot, not the stick. Here's the challenge with that. I think most folks in the legislature have acknowledged, again, from both sides of the aisle, that incentives don't really work, in part because of the property tax system. And I'll give you some extreme examples. Westport gets probably about 99% of the money that it uses to fund its local budget from local property taxes, meaning the state of Connecticut really doesn't give them anything anyway. They've already shown they can pay with their local wealth for their entire budget. They're, in other words, to stay with the carrot and the stick, they're sort of sitting on a pile of carrots. So one more carrot offered from the state is not going to be really enough to change that. However, whoever the next governor is likely not to want to change it. So I don't think, there may be some movement around the edges, but I don't think you're going to see too much in that area. But unfortunately, that's kind of going to be the same theme that I open up when I talk about healthcare. Roe versus Wade and the Dobbs decision is absolutely an important issue. And I think at the national level, candidates for US Senate and for the US House can expect to face questions about giving women access to abortion rights for a long time to come. But I do think in Connecticut right now, you will not see anything proposed to change the law that was passed in 1990 that basically codified Roe versus Wade. I think neither party right now could find a majority of their members in the state House or the state Senate willing to support that. What I do think is going to be more of an issue, especially if we slide into recession, is going to be the question of whether we want to continue to broaden Medicaid access to the poor. Connecticut's been able to do that a lot over the last decade, but it's largely relied on expanded federal aid to do it. This is going to continue to be an issue, particularly among undocumented children. But if we go into a prolonged recession and a sluggish recovery, don't forget the last recession, it took us 9 years before the revenues really started to bounce back. At some point, some people are going to say the state needs to start stepping up with some more of its own money, or you're going to have a healthcare crisis in Connecticut. I do expect, even though it probably has an uphill fight, that you will see the public option proposal come back. This is the idea of having the state comptroller use the state's purchasing power to negotiate a health plan that private individuals could use. It does have an uphill fight, but it's been enacted in Nevada and Colorado. So the advocates are pushing for that. I do just want to mention lastly in healthcare, I don't think this also gets enough press, and that is there's a real concern, and not just coming from labor unions, that the state's healthcare and social service agencies are very, very low on staff. Just to give you an idea, under the 8 years under Governor Malloy, from 2011 through 2018, we had a 10% drop in the executive branch workforce. That was something that was agreed upon by the governor and the legislature, and they often used attrition to try to deal with budget deficits. And unfortunately, in that 8-year period, budget deficits were plenty. So that was something that we used often to balance the budget. It's taken a toll over time. There's always been sort of a perception that state agencies are overstaffed or even bloated. That's really not the case anymore. And then to make things more challenging, between January and June 30th of this year, we had about 4,400 state employees retire. Everybody was rushing to get out the door. They called it the silver tsunami before some new rules tightening pension benefits kicked in. Well, that's double. We usually get about 2,000 retirements in an entire calendar year. So that's going to put a lot more strain on these programs. And I think you're going to see a strong push next year for people to actually start beefing up state staffing. Wanted to pivot quickly to crime. We just had a report this week that came from the Lamont administration that's actually said violent crime dropped in Connecticut by about 9% over the last year, and overall crime by about 3%. This is significant only because the Republican candidates are certainly making it the centerpiece of a lot of their campaigns, that crime is worse in Connecticut. I do want to note that this study that came out said unresolved cases are up significantly. They've grown from like 15 to 23%. So while the overall number of cases may be down, the number of cases that are actually getting resolved is probably just treading water. There are a few other things I wanted to mention on crime. Bob Stefanowski has said that the police accountability bill that passed in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota has made it difficult to recruit police. This is going to be, I think, a heated debate. I wouldn't even attempt to predict an outcome on this one. This bill that I'm talking about limits immunity for police in civil lawsuits. Governor Lamont does not want to see that bill repealed. I think whoever's governor would have a tough time, honestly, no matter what they propose. I think it is that contentious of an issue. I should also just mention, when it comes to gun ownership laws, this has developed a lot of, I guess I'll say again, rhetoric in the gubernatorial campaign. If you remember, in 2018, Mr. Stefanowski came out and said he'd veto any bill that made it more difficult to own a gun. Now he's saying Connecticut has the strongest gun laws in the entire country, and that's the way it should stay. Governor Lamont, of course, is saying, well, let's look at Bob's track record. I think either way, the legislature is not disposed to change that. So while you're hearing about that on the campaign trail, I would not look for dramatic change in that area. I do want to, it's funny, I'm kind of pivoting from Prime into energy, and you're going to wonder, how do I get to the Connecticut Port Authority? This could be a wild card. There could be a lot at stake in this session to come, and there could be a lot at stake in the last few weeks of the election, depending on what happens with federal investigators. And just to remind folks, we learned last October that federal investigators were looking into projects overseen at the time by Governor Lamont's deputy budget director, Costa Diamantis. He has since been terminated by the Lamont administration. Costa was largely overseeing two areas, primarily the state's school construction program. This is a $500 million a year program that basically the state uses to help communities build elementary and high schools, secondary schools. He also, though, was overseeing projects at the Connecticut Port Authority. The Port Authority's come under a lot of fire, not just because the cost of a New London Pier renovation project to support a wind to energy farm just keeps going up and up and up, but also because the authorities had some questionable fiscal practices that have been called out by the state auditors, and not just things like eating well and taking gifts, but the authority paid out a $520,000 success fee to these consultants that helped them find an operator for New London Pier. Those consultants included a former authority member. To make this mess a little more complicated, the state's contracting watchdog has been desperately trying to investigate the authority. Governor Lamont blocked efforts to give them staff to investigate this authority in 2021. He's reversed himself since. But the reason I'm running through this kind of sticky situation is just keep in the back of your head, over the next few weeks, we have no way of knowing if the federal authorities should come out with something that could have a real effect on the poll numbers going down the stretch. So that sort of leads me into energy. And I guess the only place that I expect to see a real debate in the General Assembly next year, I think energy prices are high in Connecticut. Of course, people are concerned about that. But the big issue right now I think that's got everyone's attention is the world is kind of flip-flopped when it comes to winter heating and energy assistance. We actually have the Republicans who are arguing that the state should immediately be appropriating more money. The Democrats, who've traditionally been the ones advocating for that, are kind of taking a wait and see approach. I'm assuming that's because Governor Lamont and the Democratic majority didn't do anything during the session. I don't think anyone wants to admit there's a problem while the campaign's going on, but I expect that to change as soon as the campaign is over. I think I would not even rule out a December special session. I think you'll see the legislature try to act very quickly in January to increase heating assistance. I also would be remiss before I close the book on energy if I didn't just mention we've had a gasoline tax holiday. I talked about it briefly earlier. Since April, it expires on December 1st. So as wonderful as those gasoline prices are now, right now I think we're the 9th lowest in the nation. They're artificially low by 25 cents a gallon on December 1st. They go up a quarter overnight. So keep that in the back of your head. Maybe you want to make sure you fill up on November 30th. Education has been interesting in this campaign. I do think you will see some things happen in the next session. Ironically, there has been a lot of talk about non-curriculum issues. Not that they're not important. I'll give you some ideas what I mean. Bob Stefanowski has said he would end all mask mandates in classrooms. Right now, we don't have much of any type of mask mandate, and I would not expect that to go back, with the only qualifier that nobody can absolutely say what's going to happen if for some reason there were a new variant that was more contagious than Omicron and you saw some huge surge in the infection rates over the winter. Well, then all bets are off. Bob Stefanowski also said he would prevent transgendered athletes from competing against females. I would just say I would think that would probably also have a tough time going far before the General Assembly. Both gubernatorial candidates, most candidates out there say they support the open choice programs. Just to remind people, we had a settlement of the long-running Chef versus O'Neill lawsuit earlier this year that expanded open choice seats and magnet school seats. What I'm not hearing a lot of talk about, and there is still a lot at stake, is we still have a significant achievement gap in Connecticut schools, and the pandemic only exacerbated that. We still really have a long way to go, and because of the property tax system that we talked about, there's really only so much you can do, because a community like Bridgeport, for example, and I'll go back to Bridgeport, and I'll go back to Westport to compare them to Bridgeport. On a per capita basis, Bridgeport's grand list is 1/10 that of Westport. They really cannot generate anything close to the revenue of a very affluent community. So there's a dramatic difference in the quality of the classes there. The legislature in 2017 passed a 10-year plan to increase the education cost sharing program. But that is basically getting us an improvement of about 10% over that time. It's gradually shifting resources away from wealthier communities to poorer ones, and it's increasing the overall amount slightly. People have said it's a step in the right direction, but most education advocates are saying it's still really baby steps. And what we don't know is, when the federal money that Connecticut received, not just state government, but school districts and towns, the federal pandemic relief expires after 2024, it's going to be very difficult to maintain things, even if we're not in an economic downturn. I wanted to very quickly mention air quality upgrades in schools, only because I do think this is an issue that hasn't gotten enough attention that really is at stake. We discovered during the pandemic that there's maybe I won't call it a loophole, but perhaps a hole in our school construction program. And that is, for the most part, if communities want to put a new air quality system, heating, ventilation system in an existing school, it's often on their own dime. If they're building a new school, that's something else. Communities started to come forward. Initially, the Lamont administration was telling folks, no, that's your problem. That was another area they modified this year. And we've put a lot of federal money in. We're about to put $150 million of state in, but I've heard people say this is a problem in the billions of dollars. I think you're going to see the legislature for years looking at, as we learn more about the coronavirus, if towns really need to have updated air quality systems in their schools, who's going to foot the bill for that? I wanted to just quickly touch upon two more areas. One is transportation. I get asked all the time, are tolls really dead? Or is this something that's going to come back? Here's what I would say. One, tolls are not dead. And I still believe it is only a question of time before Connecticut does have tolling system. That said, I could not see one being enacted definitely in the next 2-year budget cycle. We have enough money right now to keep the special transportation fund afloat. But I'd like you to keep this in mind. We are spending right now, on average, about $1.5 or $1.6 billion a year to upgrade our roads and our bridges and our rail lines. That is about 3/4 of what the DOT says. If you put the gun to their head, what do we really need to not just do the basic maintenance, but start doing the strategic improvements that will reduce congestion? We do have additional money coming from Washington, but it's not close to what we need. So at some point, as our systems get older and older and older, Connecticut's either going to do what they did, unfortunately, when the Manus River Bridge collapsed, which is react quickly and we'll see what happens, or at some point, they're going to have to start looking at tolls, because what we do is, if we raise more money with tolls, we will then be able to use that to leverage to borrow more money. The more money we borrow, the more federal aid we'll be able to leverage, and you'll be able to do a lot quicker. I think it's incredibly unpopular, so I don't think it'll be happening anytime soon, but all the measures you've heard about so far, a new highway use fee on trucks that kicks in once the gas tax holiday goes away. I don't know that you'll see it come back. those are temporary measures that are sort of putting off the problem. I think if we hadn't gone through this period of big general fund surpluses, which we can also then use to help the transportation fund, tolls might already be coming to a head by now. And then just lastly, I did want to talk about elections. This is something that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, and that's the idea of ranked choice voting. I want to make sure I say that correctly. This is something you could see acted on by the legislature next year, regardless of who the governor is. Both Governor Lamont and Bob Stefanowski support it. Right now, Connecticut only requires a plurality if you want to win a primary or a general election. I'll give you an example. 4 years ago, Bob Stefanowski won a 5-way Republican primary for governor with just 29.4% of the vote, but he still got the majority. Now, if there were other states, if this had happened rather in other states, there would actually have been a runoff between Bob and, in this case, the second place finisher, who was Danbury Mayor Mark Boughton. There seems to be interest among a significant members of both the House and Senate Democratic and Republican caucuses. So if whoever the next governor is makes this a priority, I could see this going forward. So I apologize. I knew we were going to go through a lot of stuff. I'm actually stopping about 2 minutes early by my count. So why don't we go to questions? And I'll just say again, I'll stick around as long as you guys want me. And if anybody doesn't get their question answered, please see Christina Broderick. She can give you my email, she can give you my Twitter, and we'll make sure we get your question answered.
Okay, well, we can go to the Q&A, but so far we don't really have many questions. So if you're on and you have questions for Keith, start loading them in that in the question and answer section. There is a comment from Trevor Crow. I believe she had raised her hand back when you were talking more about women's reproductive rights. And she said she's running for State Senate District 36. And when elected, she will propose a constitutional amendment for Roe. This has been received positively at over 1,500 doors that she's knocked on. So.
And you might very well, that's a good question, Christina. You may very well see people put in a constitutional amendment. We do have, as you would expect with a constitutional amendment, a pretty potentially lengthy process. If you don't get something through the House and the Senate with a 75% vote, it still passes, of course, but it's got to come back to the next legislature. So potentially you propose it in 2023. It passes, say, with, I'll just make up a number, 65% of the vote in both chambers. Okay, then it has to come back before the 2025 General Assembly. And they have to pass it a second time, only this time by a bare majority. And then it would go on the ballot in 2026. If, however, in 2023, you can get it through with a 3/4 vote in both chambers, it would go on the ballot in 2024. So it can take quite a long time to get a constitutional amendment through. But I wouldn't be surprised, just because of the importance of this issue, if you see many legislators propose that.
We have another question. What can we do to motivate our young voters, 18 to 25? What issues will engage them?
Oh, well, now it's so easy for me to say, read the Connecticut Mirror, but here's the thing. I do think a big part of the problem is, forgive me, a lack of news consumption. You have people who rely on social media, and I'm not saying social media is evil. Obviously, I've offered my Twitter address to anybody who wants to reach out to me, but it's got its limitations. When Bruce was giving his introduction, he correctly pointed out that news is shrinking. But I want to point out, even within news, they're shrinking and they're shrinking. Where the Mirror is filling the hole is probably the area of news that newspapers, radio stations, television stations, traditional news media are least interested in. That is state government, state politics, and state policy. In other words, the sports page is still not, it's thriving a lot more than the state news page. It's the area that things are really retreating. And if you believe the Gallup polls, 2/3 of high school graduates can't name the 3 branches of government. So, of course, I would love to see more focus on civics in the school. I'm 58. I can recall having, parents who read 2 daily newspapers every day, a weekly newspaper, and my mother always had the AM radio station on, listening to local news. I do think the more you can do to promote news consumption, even if it's not the Mirror, then I'll say it. It's only helpful.
What are the current options on the table for managing the underfunded state pensions plan? What role do budget surpluses, the rainy day fund, and the general fund play in pension funding?
Christina, not only are we going to answer this question, but this is going to spark more because we're going into, to pensions. What's this geek talking about? But this will help us. Okay. We have about $40 billion of pension debt. Another way to say that is for 70 years, Connecticut did not properly save for its pensions. The reason you read about them constantly, you've read about them for the last decade, is because when you hire a state employee, when a town hires a school teacher, because the state of Connecticut funds the pension for that school teacher, what they should be doing is every year that teacher or that state employee is on the job, the state should be setting aside money or the town, and the employee should be setting aside money. And then every year, the state treasurer should be taking the money that was set aside and investing it. So when that person retires 40 years from now or whatever, 30 years from now, the money to cover their retirement benefits is already there. Connecticut did not do that. And by failing to make billions of dollars of investments, we forfeited tens of billions of dollars in potential investment earnings. That is the problem that we're basically asking one generation to fix, a problem that 3 or 4 generations created. So this person was asking, what's happening to that? What are we doing? Because we've saved so much money over the last few years, we've largely poured whatever hasn't gone into the rainy day fund has gone into the pensions. And please don't misunderstand me. It is great. We have poured over the last 3 years about almost $6 billion in extra payments into the pension funds. That's on top of the $3 billion a year in required payments that we're making. But remember this number. We have $40 billion in long-term pension problems. And here's the other thing. What can make the annual pension contribution, the required contribution, go up? Well, when you go into recession and the markets go down, generally all your pension investments, nobody's fault, but the market goes down, the value of the pension investments goes down, so you have to kick in more. When a lot of employees retire, like they did this year, that's double the normal number of people who are no longer paying into the pension fund. They're taking benefits out of the pension fund. So we invested all this surplus money into the pensions, and people said that should lower our required contributions by about $330 million a year. That's great. But there are other forces that are now working the other way, and we won't know for another 2 months how much damage they did. I'm not saying it will wipe out all of that $330 million, but I expect it will wipe out a significant chunk of it. We will be dealing with pensions through the 2040s, and there's probably no way around it.
Okay. What can you tell us about the state's rollout of legalized cannabis? And will cannabis revenue exceed or fall short of the projections?
Well, the state, to its credit, has been very conservative in its projections on legalized cannabis. I think the biggest fight right now is how much the poorer urban communities should benefit from it. We've seen some people say that cannabis could bring in as much as 120 million. The state hasn't been counting on even half of that. That doesn't mean that the revenue will be of no benefit to the state, but to just put it in perspective, a $24 billion state budget, income tax brings in about 12 billion, sales tax between 4 and 5 billion. We're talking about maybe 40 or 50 million. That's about 1/5 of 1% of the general fund. I think people are going to be watching closely some of the motor vehicle statistics. If you do start seeing an increase in driving under the influence of a controlled substance. I don't think you're going to see a repeal. I don't want to exaggerate this and say you'll see a repeal of legalized cannabis, but I think you'll see people look to stiffen penalties in those areas. I hope that answered the question.
On the police accountability bill, this has been represented as the reason for lower recruitment. Is lower recruitment unique to Connecticut, or is it throughout the US?
Unfortunately, I'm not trying to take a side on this issue, but this is absolutely something that is happening all over the United States. I am not trying to say that the accountability bill could not have an effect on it. However, there's a lot of research that's showing the overall lack of health and fitness among American youth is having a huge role. People might be surprised to hear that. It's been a problem for much longer in the military, and even longer for the military special forces, where you're getting more and more high school and college graduates who are not in the physical shape necessary to get through basic or the advanced training. And I mean, I've certainly interviewed folks I still want to call it the Department of Public Safety, but it's got a longer name now, who are saying there are still issues with getting enough people who can qualify at the academy. Now, if you put on top of that something which could leave some officers or some potential officers concerned, I get that. On the other hand, this is not an issue, and I don't mean to downplay the importance of the statute either. This is not an issue that's going to be going away anytime soon. What happened with George Floyd mobilized the country, and I don't see, especially the delegations from Connecticut's urban areas, being willing to compromise on this at all. Nor am I saying they should.
Thoughts on gun control?
I really, maybe I'm missing the boat on this. I really don't see this as coming up heavily, much at stake after the election. After the tragedy at Sandy Hook, you saw, I want to say, a relatively swift, and you can say, well, what do you mean relative? Relative to what other tragedy in Connecticut? But Connecticut moved very fast to pass some of the toughest gun laws in the country. Neither party stood in the way, and there have been proposals at different times from folks on the periphery to change things. They've really never gained a lot of traction. The very fact that, without taking a side on this, Bob Stefanowski and Governor Lamont's biggest debates are what did Bob Stefanowski say 4 years ago and what does he insist is no longer pertinent now, tells me not much is going to come up next year when the legislature comes back into session.
I'm trying to, I don't know if I'm misreading this question. Connecticut taxes retirement funds way more than most states are reductions. In these taxes, part of the current tax reduction discussions. Am I misreading it?
No, I think you're reading it fine. Connecticut is slowly phasing out income taxes on pensions and annuities, depending on how much you make. That's going to be an issue, though. I think I understood the viewer's question. I don't think you're going to see Connecticut completely make that all tax-free, as much as I think both Governor Lamont and Bob Stefanowski would love to, for this reason. Connecticut, and I'm going to go back to the 2 tax fairness studies. Connecticut right now, by most metrics, has some of the greatest, if not the greatest, income and wealth inequality, certainly in the country, arguably on planet Earth. And there are people who say, yes, it would be great if the federal government were doing more in the wealth redistribution areas, like with an inheritance tax. But because Connecticut is in such extremes, because the top marginal rates on our income tax, despite what some folks might say, are still very competitive when compared with all the other neighboring states that we compete with economically. I think people see the income tax on the retirement earnings of high-end earners as a small step toward fairness. So I would be surprised to see that move.
Are candidates talking about increasing mental health services and resources, especially for youth, and supporting 988? Is there concern about Yale and Hartford's healthcare buying up more hospitals and medical practices?
I haven't heard any discussion about Yale buying up hospitals. It's a valid point. I do think, though, going back to mental health, that's a situation that you're hearing more from urban candidates. Connecticut, well, in fairness, most states really don't, despite what they say, prioritize services for folks dealing with mental illness. I think the problem is still, if you're trying to keep overall healthcare costs down and people are not trying to put too much on insurance companies, the question is then going to become, how do you fund this level of care? I think it's been very clear it's a problem that Connecticut hasn't tackled for a long time. The only reason I don't know that much is at stake in the coming session is outside of Democrats from urban areas. I'm not hearing a lot of other people talk about it.
If the early voting amendment to the state's constitution were to pass this year, do you expect that the candidates would defer in their approach to create future legislation to implement it?
Christina, I'm sorry. Could you clarify that question? Or maybe you could just read it one more time?
Yeah, I'll read it one more time. If the early voting amendment to the state's constitution were to pass this year, do you expect the candidates would differ in their approach to create future legislation to implement it?
I can tell you that neither, I assume they're talking about the gubernatorial candidates. I don't believe, and I could be wrong, I don't believe either Governor Lamont or Bob Stefanowski have talked a lot about that. I certainly would expect that it would be a priority of the legislature to get that implemented quickly and smoothly. I would be, I don't want to be here. I don't want to speak for a candidate when they haven't done it. I would suspect that Governor Lamont would perhaps be a little more supportive of quicker implementation.
We've seen an increase in the number of companies moving to Connecticut in the last couple of years. What is attracting these companies to our state, and how are we positioning our state relative to other states when it comes to attracting these companies?
I do think we've been helped. I don't want to exaggerate this. I think we have been helped by the pandemic. I think what's also, though, helped Connecticut, honestly, is companies in general have been craving what they want as, I would call, tax stability. And Connecticut came off a decade where we did not have tax stability. And I'm not going to quibble about what was the largest tax increase in all of state history, but we had a very significant tax increase in 2009, followed by one in 2011, followed by one in 2015. Since 2018 through basically all of calendar 2021, driven largely by a rebounding stock market, we have had probably 4 years of very stable budgets and huge surpluses. And I think the companies are seeing that and are looking not necessarily over the next 40 years, but over the next 5 to 10 years, do they think Connecticut can avoid is going to end that cycle? Because we still have, when you look at our top marginal income tax rate, income tax rates that are superior to New York City, New York State, New Jersey. There's going to be a lot of appeal right there. I will just quickly add, though, that a lot of economists, one in particular, but several, have described Connecticut as an IT island, that we don't have enough of an investment in IT infrastructure. And that if we don't start making investments there, especially the way the pandemic has changed the economy, we will find it hard to keep the companies that we have. I think you're going to see that become much more of a priority soon.
Most private employers do not have pensions. Is any candidate or the legislature considering ending pensions for new employees to stop future liability?
We heard that in the 2018 campaign. That was a proposal that was common out there. This time around, because usually it comes when you have a large Republican field, and that's what we had in 2018. David Stemmerman centered his campaign on this idea that perhaps we could, and he never fleshed out all the details, but he had this idea that we could borrow a lot of money and then try to buy out for pennies on the dollar vested but not yet retired state employees and municipal teachers. The unions lined up against it. I don't think anything like that would be too successful. You'll always see proposals to continue to try to scale back the pensions and move future state employees and future teachers toward a 403B or 401k. The reason those usually bog down even more than union opposition is just because about 3/4 to 80% of all of our pension debt involves folks who are already off the job. So when you see, okay, here's the potential gain for all the battle I have to have, people see, wow, it's not going to drive down the costs as much as I thought. Those costs aren't really going to change, to be blunt, until a generation of public sector employees passes on.
Since the working poor rely on public transportation, is it viable for our state to provide that benefit as in free transportation? And how can it be implemented?
We've got a free, some free transit we've had this year. We did some during the pandemic. It's mostly been using federal dollars. The problem is it's never really paid for itself. So it's always been subsidized to begin with. So I'm skeptical that you would ever see that because, again, anything that draws money out of the transportation fund, something that's another burden, and transit costs are a very fast component, that just pushes you closer to the day of tolls. And the folks in the know who see that schedule will do anything to push that back.
Okay, I think we're on our last question here.
Okay.
Would you support a tax cut versus a pay down of unfunded liabilities? Given the market correction, isn't this a great point to fund our unfunded pensions versus a tax cut?
It's a great question. And I realize they understand as a journalist, I can't tell you, but it is the ultimate question, which is, while you've got money, say you have a big credit card debt, should you put the money into credit card debt, or should you be using the money to cut taxes with the hope that that will jumpstart the economy, which will promote more revenue growth and you'll get more money that way? It really is difficult because here's why I think the majority, let's put it this way, here's why I think the majority of the legislature, both parties, have said, let's pay down taxes. Bob Stefanowski has said, let's cut taxes, but even the Republicans in the legislature have said, let's not let anything interfere with paying down that pension debt. Connecticut's revenue stream is so unstable. When the times are good from Wall Street, they boom, and when they're bad, they shrink. And we have so much debt, it would have to boom for 20 or 30 years consecutively to get us all out of it. And since there's no quick fix, people are pretty much going for the sure thing. And I think that's how they see paying down pension debt.
I'm going to take the Mickey because one more question came in, and I'm going to let it go. We're going to let them do it. Are both gubernatorial candidates concerned, or rather unconcerned, about A, consumer business protection against cyber attacks, fraud, and B, sufficient water, drought, and energy, aka heating, AC, electric, internet supplies for our state for the next 15 to 20 years?
Okay. I have not heard anybody talk about consumer business fraud. I'm not saying nobody cares. I could have missed something. When it comes to water resources, heating, AC, honestly, I have not heard much of that. The only thing that I will say is I certainly hear Governor Lamont a little more than Bob Stefanowski, but certainly both candidates have talked about the need to improve IT infrastructure, the need to improve, say, Wi-Fi capacity, the availability of high-speed internet. We have a lot of suburban areas. I live in Farmington. I can attest to this, where the Wi-Fi is just still notoriously slow. And that's something that, again, as you move into a post-pandemic economy, a lot of businesses are going to be looking for. I hope that answered that last question. But anything I didn't get to, again, Christina, please invite people to email me or send me something on Twitter.
Yeah. So at this point, yeah, I do just want to say a huge thank you to you, Keith, on behalf of League of Women Voters. This was incredibly informative.
It was a pleasure.
If people are left with questions out there, you know, they have your information. So I do hope that they reach out. But I just felt this was very insightful, and hopefully everyone will feel a bit more confident when they go to the polls in November. To place their vote. So on that note, I just want to say thank you, and everyone have a wonderful evening and enjoy the rest of your night.